In an age when knowledge is increasingly accessible, wisdom often costs us something. It requires us to exercise vulnerability, get comfortable with risk, and do the hard work of staying connected to each other. Today's guest, Dr. Uli Chi, describes for us that wisdom is both appropriately elusive and wrapped up in the mystery of what it means to be a person. He also tells us the three hardest words he's had to learn to say as a leader and what he wishes his younger self knew about walking in the way of wisdom. Dr. Uli Chi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Michaela. It's so good to see you.
It's really good to see you, and I am really pleased about this episode in particular. So, for those who have been listening along, Uli, for you, the entire theme of this season is wisdom. And
Mm,
as a reminder, this podcast is all about the hidden work of leadership, the parts of leadership
mhm,
that aren't always in the limelight, that aren't always seen. And that connects to some of the flourishing leaders data that we've researched and collected at Dupree Center. And when we were kind of coming up with our guest list of who we had to have on this season, you were number one on the list. And let me say a little bit more about why, and then I'll drop in the first question. So I've described you to many people as the wisest person I know in real life, which is, I know, very daunting and ominous, but I promise you live up to it. And out of that lived experience and expertise, you've recently written a really wonderful book. The book is called The Wise Leader. And when I look around at different pieces and trying to, kind of for my own thinking and inquiry of trying to grasp this topic of wisdom and how to live it out as a leader today, I
mm,
think you've just given us a gift. So I'm very grateful that you've come onto the
mm.
podcast today.
Well, thank you, Michaela. It's very kind of you to say, and I'll try to live up to a fraction of your billing here today.
I promise you, we won't give you, well, maybe we will just for fun, let everybody rate you at the end. But
Yes, you should.
okay. All right, let me go in with the first question. So, and we've talked about this, really
Mm,
the idea that in today's world, we are in desperate need of more good
mm,
leaders, and
mm,
that good leadership means a lot of things, and the world is very complex, but that certainly central to the qualities of what it means to be a good leader is to be able to practice wisdom, to
mm.
live wisely. And so I'm going to start just with, what do you think wisdom is, and where do you think it comes from?
Well, it's a great question, isn't it? I mean, I think spent a lot of time obviously thinking about that as well as trying to write a few things about it. I think it's a tough thing to answer. Actually, wisdom is one of those things that's a bit elusive in terms of
Hmm.
trying to nail it down. It's sort of there are many, there are other things about things like knowledge and information and things. We can be fairly descriptive or definitional about it. But I think the truth is wisdom is better described than it is defined. I
Mm.
know people who've read my book. I know you have maybe thought the same thing. Is that at the end of it, you think, he never actually defines wisdom any. So I got
I
away.
did notice that.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that was kind of clever of me, wasn't it? But I think in some ways, it wasn't just, trying to avoid something. I think it reflects the fact for me that wisdom is very complicated. And it's complicated for a reason. I think it's because it really has to do with more of a way of life than it does with a set of knowledge or information that somebody has,
Hmm.
or even a skill set that you could develop. And I think it, for me, wisdom is about I think a way of life is a helpful sort of metaphor for describing what wisdom is about, and it leads to flourishing for human beings. And it's learned in relationships. I think
Hmm.
that's maybe a way to summarize what wisdom is, and as I think about it. And I think it's not something that is easily put in a box or looked up in a dictionary. I've Googled as part of my process, different definitions of wisdom, and they all sort of you know, eh, they sort of give you a sense of what it is, but they don't really you come away still scratching your head a bit saying, I'm not in a certain sense, I'm none the wiser about what wisdom actually is. But I think it's ultimately rooted in the fact that wisdom is about rooted in the mystery of being a person.
Mm.
Wisdom has to do with it's an attribute of a person rather than simply a characteristic. And for those folks who've asked me in the last year about how I would define wisdom, my sort of working definition, if I had to give one, is it's sort of the art of being human.
Mm.
It's really an art of. It's not it's not like it's a science or anything, but I think it's an art of how do you live in a way that contributes to the flourishing of the world in which we find ourselves, to other human beings, particularly in the leadership context, right? Being able to um, exhibit the characteristics that lead to other people's flourishing. That has a lot to do with relationships. Has a lot to do with you and I've talked about. The pre-center is deeply concerned about helping folks develop mentoring relationships, and I think
Mhm.
mentoring is part of how we learn wisdom. It's better caught than taught. This
Mm.
saying used to be right, and I think the other piece of it is wisdom is there's a risk aspect of wisdom that you have to be willing to risk yourself in a certain sense to gain wisdom. You know, we talk a lot about today about knowledge being essentially like being free, right? You can Google almost anything. You can ask ChatGPT about almost anything. Knowledge may be free, but I think wisdom is expensive because I think it requires risking yourself personally in terms of being vulnerable, being willing to be in relationships with other people. You're not just talking about ideas. You're not just you're really interacting with others in a particular way and in a way that leads to flourishing.
Hmm. Okay, let me mirror back some things there, and then I'm gonna pull at a few threads. So, wisdom is better described than defined, caught than taught, developed in and among relationship, people. I do hear you saying that wisdom, in a sense, there's an end goal, a direction. You're using the word
Yes.
flourishing, right? It's moving towards something.
Right.
Um, and I also hear you giving us permission actually to not it's not logical, right? It's not logical. The thing I will say though, and this is what I want to sort of toss back to you is as abstract as it is, as relationally developed as it is hard to sort of define, I also think you know it when you see it.
Yeah. No.
And, like, you and I were in a meeting recently, and somebody said something, and the rest of us perked up and was like, "Oh, that was wise." So,
Mm.
do you feel like talk to us about our own attunement and our ability to recognize wisdom.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think because that's an interesting observation because I think there is a sense in which you know, like you say, when we see it, when we recognize when we see it, and I think that in part it's because I think as we believe we're made in the image of God, that there's somehow in us a capacity to recognize certain things as being wise and certain things are not. Um, I said in my book at the very end, I think there's a wonderful passage in Deuteronomy where Moses is getting ready to preach the Deuteronomy sermon to Israel on the banks of the Jordan, about to enter the promised land. And one of the things he says about Israel is that when they live according to the, the instruction that God has given for human beings, that people in the surrounding nations will look at them and say, "What a wise people these
Mm.
folks are! What great
Mm.
and wise laws they have!" And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, these are not
Mhm.
even Israelites, right? Somehow there's an instinctive reaction that says, "Yes, this is right." And I think we see that, when people are being genuinely kind and caring and this is another aspect of wisdom. Wisdom is not just about what we think or even what we say, but how we behave towards others. And those are all these characteristics that are actually deeply aspects of being a person in relationship with other people and being
Mm.
able to model generosity, grace, kindness, honesty, faithfulness. I mean, those are the attributes people say, that's a you see wisdom in that, right, in the way people are acting, and so no,
Hmm.
I think that's a good insight, Michaela. I'm not sure I'd actually thought about it quite in that way, but I think, there's a resonance with when you see real wisdom.
So then, this art of being human, this wisdom that is visible, this thing that gets worked out that takes risk. Give me your assessment on the presence or lack thereof in society and culture and Christian circles, wherever you want to go.
Yeah.
Workplaces and businesses. I'm just curious, like, are we a wise people today? Are we not? Have we strayed from that? What do you see?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I mean, sort of what you sometimes see on the news and social media and stuff, you shake your head a bit and say, "That doesn't look very wise to me," right, in terms of, and I think, um, but I think in terms of you see wisdom oftentimes in the places where that's not quite as visible or as, where the spotlight doesn't shine as brightly. See, I'm part of a health system in the Pacific Northwest, and, we have thousands of nurses and hundreds of doctors and staff people who take care of people every day who are incredibly committed and wise and skilled in terms of providing healthcare to folks. And, that doesn't make the evening news a lot, right? And so I suspect there's more wisdom in the world in that sense than we realize, and that we tend to
Mhm.
see the drama that often isn't very wise, I don't think. Um, and I think, so that's one observation. That's maybe on the positive side. I think on the sort of challenging side, I think the reality is we live in a really complicated world. I mean,
Yeah.
whether you're in business or politics or government or in, whatever sphere of life and education, you know, we live in a time where I mean, we have more knowledge, more access to knowledge than any generation before us, right? I mean, all the technology stuff makes this, we can ask almost any question and get some kind of answer. Whether it's any good or not, or whether it's wise is another question. But I think we just have a lot of complexity in the world. And I think that what it drives us to, I think, is that it tends to make us want to look for simplistic answers.
Hmm.
And I think as folks who are trying to manage the world in which we're living in and dealing with these, and in living in a very polarized kind of environment where people are, picking their corners or picking their teams that they want to be on, and sort of viewing everyone else as being, the enemy. I think it creates anxiety and it creates a desire to see the world more simply. And I think, in that
Hmm.
sense, I think we've lost wisdom in the sense that wisdom itself is complex and nuanced. There's a lot of, in fact, mystery in terms of dealing with other human beings, and we just want to we just want to put a label on people and say, "Well, you're this kind of person, or you're that kind of person." I think the act of doing that makes us unwise, and I
Hmm.
think we're all at risk of that, and I'm at risk of it. I think
Sure.
just part of it's just coping with the fact I'm dealing with far more people than people were 100 years ago, right? And so you're
Yeah.
just trying to figure out how to navigate all that. I think what wisdom teaches us, one of the fundamental lessons is whatever label you put on a person isn't who they are.
Hmm.
That the,
Hmm.
the person that you're dealing with is made in the image of God, far more complex and in many ways totally mysterious. And it'll take you, whatever you think you know about the person is at best an approximation to the reality of it. So
Hmm. I really appreciate that, assessment, right? That, again, a lot of the wisest actions that are taking place today might be outside of the spotlight. That might be the hidden work of leadership that we're talking about, and that I think it's human. I'll use my own words here. Human instinct. It's natural. It's not bad to crave clarity and structure in the midst of
true.
complexity. But that one of the risks there that we, instead of taking the risk of wading into the complexity without clear answers and letting ourselves sort of go into the way of wisdom and to look for concrete things that get us out of the mess faster, is we bypass a lot of the mystery of other people and the goodness. And even what God might have for us. One of the things I'm just really struck by, I feel like your book is a book for anybody. I could give it to someone I know who has a very different belief system than mine and who would describe it very differently. But you do reference over and over the Jewish and Christian tradition, namely the scriptures. So I'm curious on kind of a broad level, what do you see? You've talked about, you've already given us a couple examples, but just to kind of put a fine point on it, what do you see that scripture is telling us about wisdom in a way that's relevant to people working in the kind of complexity that you just described today?
Yeah, I think I mean, I guess unsurprisingly, I find it very helpful. But I think it's several things. One is, again, I've grown up in the scientific disciplines, and I didn't grow up in a Christian context, so that's probably helpful for some of the folks in the audience to know. And I came to faith, relatively early, but I didn't come in with the assumptions that perhaps others, who have had the benefit of that history. But I think one of the things I think I would wrestle with, and I think we particularly in the West wrestle with, is sort of what you might call a secular view of the world, which basically says that we are just basically biological machines. That human beings are the product of a impersonal you know process that got us to where we are. And so I think what the biblical narrative suggests to us is that there's more to being human. Yes, there's no
Mm,
question we are biological creatures, but that's not all that we are. And I think what that does for us is it reminds us that there is fundamental dignity to being human. And I think as I have a lot of living in the Seattle area, I have lots of friends who are not doesn't aren't people of faith at all, and who sort of wonder about whether you know the Christian faith is a good thing even, or has anything to offer of value. But I think I have to remind myself, and sometimes I in conversations I say to them, the things that you care about most deeply, things
mm.
like the dignity of the human person, that all people have dignity, and that we should treat people on the margins with generosity and so on. Those are deeply Christian values, actually, and the world wasn't always like that. 2,000 years ago, people didn't treat people like that, right? And Jesus changed the human history in many ways, and that tells us a different way of being human and how to be wise. Actually, wisdom, and I think at sort of what we were talking about earlier, there's a resonance that when you behave that way, when you're generous towards those who are on the margins, when you treat all people, as people with dignity, that is a that's a that's a really wise thing, and I think that's an important thing for us to remember. And I think what we're seeing in the world today, in many ways, whether in business or otherwise, is it's easy to not treat people like that, right? That we treat people instrumentally rather than as having intrinsic value. That they become an instrument, they become a vehicle to achieve our success or our business goals. And yes, as a business guy, I'm committed to achieving goals, but we need to do that in a way that's values people for who they are and what they bring. So that's one very, very core aspect, I think, of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, it also, I mean, we share a love for and a common work at the center, the Dupree Center, the Max Dupree Center for Leadership. And when I look at Max's work, I see this too, that bottom line, like, goals matter. We're not against making money, but that people are at the heart and soul of all that counts. And to be able to draw that back to the scriptures and
Mm.
the value of human dignity,
That's right.
and to say how that works out in today's workplace, I just think that's huge. Okay, a couple of questions that are, yeah, go ahead.
Consider one more thing on that. I completely agree. I think people do ultimately matter, and people are distinctively. I think again the scriptures I think lay the foundation of saying human beings sort of are unique and distinctive in being made in the image of God. And I think that explains a lot of why we can sort of understand the world even the way we understand it, which is surprising, actually. Why should a biological creature be able to do that? I mean,
Mhm.
mathematics explaining all this stuff, I mean,
Mhm.
it's kind of a bizarre thing at one level. So I think that's really important. And the other thing is that, and sometimes from my experience of the Christian tradition that I've grown up most of my life with, is that I think sometimes it's easy to overplay that to the point of saying,
Sure.
right, that human beings are all that matter. And I don't think
Sure.
that's correct, right? I think if you look at the biblical narrative as a whole, you say, in Genesis at least, why did God create human beings? Well, he created human beings to care for his creation, right? To steward the
Mhm.
creation. So I love that's why I think sort of both our mission and our communities matter, right? I mean, both things,
Mhm.
we have a role to play, and it's not just about taking care of people,
That's
and so
right.
the planet doesn't matter. But I think in this generation, we're much more, I think, attuned to the fact that there's a holistic way of looking at it where both things matter.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I mean, it's wise. It would be easy to at the I mean, it makes so much sense to sort of recenter or work to center the value of human dignity because of all that's going on in the world. And then all of a sudden you're like, "Wait, do we swing the pendulum too far? What about the rest of the created world?" And I would say, like, what about the long arc of the mission of God at work
Right.
to redeem and restore? Like, there's just
Right.
so much going on.
Exactly.
Um, and I think on the best days, I'm like, humans are playing a great part in that. And on the days where I feel more critical, I'm like, we've lost the way of wisdom. One of the things that is not insignificant even to the Genesis narrative that you described is not I feel like it goes along with the people thing. Something I find provocative in your work, let me set it up by saying, I people today, good and faithful Christians, people who do not subscribe to Christian faith, people who are in structural leadership, people who are not in structural leadership, people who do all their work for a paycheck, people who do all their work and never get a dime, fall down on different sides of what I'm about to say. And this is the relationship between power and humility.
Mm.
So there are some that would say for people who have uh, found themselves with a lot of power, the goal is to abdicate that and give it away to other people.
Mm.
There are others that would take a different stance. I am really curious what the way of wisdom, to use your language here, tells us about the relationship between power and humility and all the context that I just alluded to.
Well, I think I really appreciate you asking that, because I think in just as a preamble, that's the question actually, relationship of power, humility, that sort of started me to think about writing the book. Because I think for
Mm.
me, that's been the central question as a leader, trying to, wrestle with what does it mean to look like a really human leader. Um, and I think like you say, you tend to go in one extreme or the other. Either you sort of hoard power, yeah, and treat it as an idol, or you go in the other extreme and say, well, I shouldn't, we're called to be humble, and therefore we shouldn't exercise power at all. We shouldn't aspire to have power. And I think the reality for me is that I think I found that, and I think not just I found, but um, leaders inherently have power, whether they want it or not. And I think the
Yeah.
real question is, how do we use that power, right? And so I think I found it helpful in John Dixon, who wrote a wonderful book called Humilitas, which is sort of traces the history of humility in
Hmm.
the last couple of thousand years, in particular how Jesus is shaped as our understanding of that. Um, has argued that humility, in the sense that Jesus understands it, is the right use of power in service of others. And
Hmm.
so I think that's how, for me, I think wisdom really sort of brings together humility and power, not as two opposite and and irreconcilable things, but as two things that sort of reflect two aspects of the same thing. Humility, with respect to leadership, our task is to serve others with the power that we have, and not simply to abdicate our
Yeah.
role in doing that. Right? It would be easy to say, as a leader, if you said, "Well, I'm going to just not exercise my power." Well, you've been given that power to serve the community and to serve the mission that you're supposed to engage in. And so I think that's a very helpful way for me to put two things together that seemed like oil and water before that we didn't seem to mix. And
Hmm.
so, yeah.
One of the ways that I have practically seen this show up, and I'm gonna link this to the knowledge versus wisdom, knowledge and
Mhm.
wisdom. Maybe those are two sides of a different coin. I'm not sure. But one of the most practical ways I've seen leaders who I respect and trust, people who I respect and trust, navigate this space between power and humility is actually with the simple phrase, when appropriate, I don't know.
Mm,
Um, and just the risk taking that involves not
mhm,
that I don't care, I'm not in it, I'm not, we're not moving, but that I don't know. When I hear that I don't know,
mm,
and it's sort of marked by some other things, it signals to me that somebody's paradigms have moved from or don't include this, okay, I have to be the expert in the
right.
room,
Right.
to I have to move wisely. Can you talk about that knowledge versus wisdom as it relates to power and humility here?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think knowledge is often power, right? And we use knowledge
Mhm.
as a way to show that we know what we're doing, that we are worthy of our role and all sorts of things. And I think I agree with you. I mean, I've said before that the three hardest words I've had to say as a leader is not that I was wrong, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Is I think it raises the question of competency,
Mhm.
raises the question of, why are you in that role?
Mhm.
Right? If you don't
Mhm.
know, right, you're supposed to know. But I think fundamentally, I think that's why power without humility is is really dangerous because it creates the illusion that we are godlike and we're not,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
And I think part of our task is to embrace the fact we are not. There is a God, but we're not God, and therefore we need to acknowledge our limitations as leaders. And I find, uh, like you said, I think the leaders I admire greatly, Max was one of them, was his ability to not only say I don't know, but to act like he knew his limits.
Mhm.
I think,
Mhm.
and this is a big issue, not only, in the world, but in the church. I think sometimes those of us who have leadership roles in the church, as I have, as I know you have, you know, we carry a greater weight, a burden in a certain sense, or weight of you're doing God's work, right? You're not just doing quote any work, to really want to make that distinction. But I think there's a sense of responsibility and feel like, well, I should know and I need to know. If I don't know, then that's not good, right? I'm not doing my job.
Mhm.
But I think Max modeled a different way, and one that I've learned a lot from. Of it's okay to say I don't know.
Yeah.
It's okay to say that I'm not, and say it sort of out loud. I'm not God, right? You may
Yeah.
think, and I think the risk is too that people attribute godlike qualities to leaders, and I think
Mhm.
it comes with the fact that power. We are in the image of God, and therefore we're representing God. So therefore, it's easy for people to think of us like they think about God. In a certain sense, we are like God in that sense. Right? We're made in the likeness of God, right? That's sort of what that means. But I think that we need to recognize there's a line, right? That we are not God, and therefore part of how we exhibit that is by acknowledging our limitations, and then that's how we exercise humility. And I don't know is a great place to start.
Okay, and if I have any alarm bells about all this, here's where they go off. Because I don't know how one gets to what we're talking about, what you're doubling down on, what you've described for us, without being deeply in relationship with other people. And every piece of data that's come out over the last couple of years has signaled that as a at least a Western culture, people feel more isolated, they feel more alone, they feel more anxious and unsure. And I I I just don't though I'm like, okay, we need people embedded in relationship and in community in order to be able to do the things that you're talking about both now and in the future. And the data would suggest that people am painting broad brushstrokes, but are having difficulty with that level of relationship and community. Like
Mm.
what would you say to that?
I think I think I would say it's helpful just to know there's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And we think sometimes I think the reason I say that is because I think we've grown up in what's made that worse, I think, in the West in particular, and the Christian church in the West, is that we've had a heroic model of leadership
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
rather than a team-based model of leadership, right? I think your generation is actually better than that, better than
Mhm.
those of in me and my generation in terms of, seeing leadership as being more of a team sport rather than an individual sport. I had a very good. If I can tell a quick story here, I think
Please.
I had a really good friend who's now with the Lord, but he was somebody I admired greatly. He was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. We were good friends, and uh, had remarkable character in terms of he was known as a fine Christian leader, and I I admired him in many ways, sort of like I admired Max. And as we got to know each other and spend more time together, um, at one point he sort of confided more in me about his experience of being a leader.
Mm.
And he said to me at one point, and he had tears in his eyes when he said this. He said, leadership for me is a pretty lonely experience.
Mm, mhm.
And then he
Mhm.
said, um, and I know I made it that way.
Wow.
Right?
Wow. You don't hear the second thing very often.
No, I mean, you experience the first, but you don't acknowledge the second, right?
Mm.
We talked a bit, but it was sad to me that, but I understood it because sort of the that's the milk and the water I drank and swam
Mm.
in, right? In terms of that's how leadership's supposed to be. Leadership is it's lonely at the top, right? You're supposed to be the one and do all this stuff, and
Yeah.
I think what I think wisdom teaches us, particularly biblical wisdom, is that it doesn't have to be that way, right?
Mhm.
And that we and but it's very countercultural,
Yeah.
and not just in the church, but not just in the world, but in the church too. And I think it takes intentionality and it takes work. And it's a lot of hard work to do that, and it requires vulnerability in a way that many of us who are in those roles tend to shut ourselves off from that, right? And to say no, that's
Yeah.
not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and I would add, I think as individuals, we're all it's all sort of it's systems thinking. So we're all connected, right? We're the product of systems and we contribute to them. And so I think that it's not it is on us with the power to be able to, engage and invest in a variety of types of relationships that, the mantra that is always in my head is people who don't give a care what you do out for work. They just love you because they love you, right? Those
Mm.
kind of people, to your mentors, to your comrades, to the people you're working alongside. But I also think, organizational culture and business and, education and healthcare and politics, that we reinforce that hero's mindset. And I'm thinking now of an episode that we're gonna have in this season that features Patrick Reyes, who if you're listening and you're thinking, "Yeah, I wanna explore or hear more about this collaborative approach,"
Mm.
Reyes really gets into this as a wise way forward, being able to locate ourselves, in a series of generations, really. So that just that these are that's a good tie-in there.
Next.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've covered everything from the risk taking to the art of being human to getting comfortable with the idea that wisdom is a bit elusive and that's healthy. And maybe our job is to sort of pursue it together and to work it out in complex times. I'm struck that you're able to articulate so much of this. You have a life of experience, of expertise, of fits and starts, of failures, of things going well, not going well, all of that. And Uli, you know that at the Dupree Center, we think about our work a lot in terms of the thirds of life and leadership. The first third, where you're just kind of, getting going and trying the things and figuring out who you are. The second third, when usually the demands of life and work and family and leadership for some people increase. And then third, where questions of purpose and wisdom take on new dimensions. But as a person who's in your third, what I would love is for you to look back at maybe first third Uli, 25-year-old Uli. What advice would you give him about living the way of wisdom?
Mm. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there's so where do I begin, right? So that's perhaps in some ways the book is. I attempt to do some of that, but I think I guess three things. I think the first thing is we talked about this a bit already, but this understanding that we are both finite. We have limitations in terms of our knowledge, in terms of our abilities, and that we are, in addition to that, we're fallen creatures.
Hmm.
I think when I was younger, and I think this is not uncommon, is I think, you know, I had the sense that I could do most anything I wanted to do. I mean, I think
Mhm.
many folks sort of reinforce that, right? As people tell you, oh, if you can do whatever you want to, if you put your mind to it, whatever. And that's not, turns out that's not true, but it can seem to be true at the time, right? So I think there is, but I think, and that's not necessarily a bad thing entirely, right? I think it helps us to dream and imagine. But I think I lacked a certain humility about
Mm.
that. I didn't. I think I knew more. I was able to do more than I actually was, and I think that isn't again meant to discourage us from trying, but to remind us that there are limits. And I think wisdom requires us to acknowledge that and to create space and not. And I think it affected the way I think I came across to other people. So that's one thing of it.
Mm.
I think the second piece is, um, I think I would tell my younger self to be more curious rather than
Mm.
to be certain. I
Mm.
think I came to faith. I think I said early on, and it was in my teens, and I think as a person of faith who is relatively new, I think I was wanting to demonstrate my certainty about my faith in a way that sometimes was okay, but sometimes was actually not very helpful. And that I would have been better being more curious rather than simply saying, well, of course, I believe these things and you should too. And this is what all this means. And I think curiosity is I find as I've gotten older and as I've thought more about wisdom, I think curiosity is in many ways at the heart of wisdom, one of the key elements at the heart of wisdom.
Hmm.
And then the third thing is, I think, what we were just talking about it a little while ago, that leadership is a team sport, not an individual one, right? That
Mhm.
I think I grew up with a heroic model of leadership. I wish I had learned earlier
Mm.
that
Mm.
it doesn't one it one it doesn't need to be that way, and it's better if it's not.
Mm. Mm. Wow. So humility, curiosity, and the invitation and the value shift that leadership is a team sport. Mm.
Mm.
Uli, thank you so much. That brought me so much joy, and I really just appreciate. I feel like you just dropped a lot of wisdom on us. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the chance to. It's always a joy to not only to talk about this, but to talk about it with you. So, thank you for the invitation to do it.
Thank you for tuning in to The Hidden Work of Leadership. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it insightful. The Hidden Work of Leadership is brought to you by the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, where we envision a world in which leaders across industries and seasons of life are deeply formed as the people of God so that they might seek the very best for the people and systems entrusted to their care. Our episodes are produced by Justin Heap, who ensures our engineering and editing is engaging and sounds just right. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. You can also follow the Dupree Center on LinkedIn and Instagram for updates and behind-the-scenes content. For more information about today's episode and access to additional resources, visit our website at dupree.org. That's DEPREE.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Hidden Work of Leadership.